Hi everyone, I'm Judd Goodman. I'm a senior civil engineer with Marin County Flood Control District. I am the project director for the Bridge Building 2 removal project. So I wanted to have this office hours. We might need to have extended office hours next time. It's a good showing. I appreciate everyone being here. The point of it is to have more of a face-to-face conversation, provide information, and try to open with transparency on the project, where we're at, and answer questions and hear perspectives of the community. I was thinking this would be relatively informal, but maybe we can I get a raise of hands of who has specific questions that they brought to the meeting today?
I have questions.
So we have like maybe 5 initially, and it's fine if there's more that come up. Yeah. So maybe we'll just go in order from the front and navigate this way. Well, it's a bigger setting. Yeah.
Given the controversial nature of this issue, I thought there'd be 1,000 people here, but so this is kind of surprising to me. But I think what we all came to hear is what the hell the county is going to do.
Yeah. A bit of information that's being released on the website. And so as part of our communication, we had the advisory board meeting back in February. That was on Zoom to make it more available to public, as well as the broadcast, the recording is online on the district website, as well as the staff report and packets related to that. So in that, there was a presentation that I gave on the BB2 removal project. And we also have a series of, we've updated our frequently asked questions to provide some more update on the SAFER website, as well as we received specific questions from community members who may not be necessarily in the frequently asked questions category, but we've received such a volume of interest and comments and questions that I've been on the project since January, and we're going through with our communications team proper, thorough responses. So those are being released. The first 20 or so have been released on the website now, and there will be an announcement about that. I'd say overall where we're at is we are really focused on getting the FEMA conditional letter of map revision. That's an opportunity for FEMA to review what the development plan is and be able to comment, because the project does have to do with a change in the floodplain and floodway as mapped in the flood insurance rate maps, the FEMA flood insurance rate maps. And so for most of the community, those will look like reductions in that extent. So that could really be of benefit for those who are now paying for flood insurance. You have more options in that realm, because some will be removed from the floodplain. And then so as part of the conditional letter of map revision, if there are any properties that are affected by rise in modeled base flood elevation, so when I talk about base flood elevation, that's the FEMA modeling analysis, looking at, in this case, a one-dimensional hydraulic model that is the basis for the current effective flood maps. Modification to that with removing BB2, as many of you may be aware of, the floodplain overall will shrink due to the project, particularly in those more frequent, less, not as high of magnitude as, say, the 100-year event, but the real benefits are things like the 10-year event, which occurs on average 10 times more frequently than the 100-year event, but still causes flood damage in the community. So we are focused on that Clomer application right now, and we've been doing some survey work to look at if a property has a modeled rise in that base flood elevation, does that rise translate to impact to a structure, particularly a residential structure? And then if there is an impact, what are the appropriate mitigations? So we're kind of answering three things right now that we're in the trenches with for those properties that have a modeled rise associated with them. So yeah, that's the timeline for the Clomer application. Is we're trying to get that application into FEMA for review in the second quarter of this year. So by the end of June, hopefully earlier than that. And in it we'll have the mapped, how the flood map would be revised for the community, as well as for those properties that have limited rise of that 100-year flood, modeled flood water surface, that assessment for each of those properties of what is the rise, what is the impact, and what is appropriate mitigation is a part of that Clomer application. And
you want to define a Clomer application?
It's a conditional letter of map revision. So that's where if there's a project that affects the floodplain and where the flood insurance rate maps would be changed, this is the process for FEMA to review the impacts and to provide their approval to make sure that this is an appropriate project to build before it's built. Yes.
Seeing the FAQs, that there could be more erosion after the bridge is removed. People have raised concerns about some of the trees that are there now. Do you have any definitive information or arborist report on what might happen to some of the trees that are either too close to the current bank, or can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we're in the process of hiring an arborist who specializes in redwood trees in order to look at just that, what's an appropriate monitoring program during the construction of the project, as well as come up with appropriate mitigations if needed. So we're in the process of hiring, and I know at the future San Anselmo Town Council meeting, that's a topic of interest that we plan to talk about. Once we have the arborist on board, we have a sense for what the tree monitoring and management plan looks like. Yes.
Can you give us a little more background? You just started, and you're the leader, you're the executive in this process at this point in time, and you just started in January, is that correct?
I'm the public face of the project. We have other staff who are working day to day to get what needs to be done to make progress on the project. So there's a lot to do. So rather than having we have a great project manager, Ann Bartlett. She's been great in getting up to speed with everything. She actually started in October of last year. Very experienced project manager. So she's dealing with the contracts and the consultants, the nuts and bolts and the logistics, and making sure. And I'm considered. She's the project manager, and I'm considered the project director. So I'm trying to keep more of the public face of the project, answer people's questions so that Ann can get the work done that we need to, actually make it happen. Yes?
Back to the trees.
Tell me if I'm wrong. I thought that it was against the law to take down any California native tree. If what you do destroys the roots of those trees, which are shallow, wouldn't your effort be illegal?
That would be a good question for the arborist to answer who specializes in redwood trees. I do know that there are other projects where, infrastructure projects where it's around protection, safety of the public, where you can remove a native tree, but that does require some mitigation. So planting additional trees elsewhere or nearby in order to compensate for that loss. In some cases,
Native trees or invasive trees?
both. There may be a higher, depending on the situation, there may be a higher ratio of the number of trees that you need to plant in order to mitigate for that loss. But we know that the redwoods are valued by the community, and so we're trying to do what we can to protect them appropriately.
What happens if your arborist says, if you take out Building Bridge 2, the trees will die?
Yeah, I think that's, before we jump there, we need to hire the arborist and have them do the appropriate studies.
We look at how close the redwoods are to where the excavation will be.
Mm-hmm.
Redwoods have shallow root systems that reach out, and it looks like at least the first front group are going to have their roots just chopped off.
Okay. Well, we want the technical experts to look at it, and we want to be open and transparent about what the plan is with everyone.
We really appreciate the open and transparency part of that statement. A lot of us have been working on this for a long time. Originally, the concern and the plaza was fenced in kind of instantaneously because it was deemed to be an earthquake risk. If there was a large earthquake, it looked like it could be a problem. Well, we've had structural engineers that have looked at it and said it can easily be repaired. So this is a concern right there. The redwoods are a concern. Then we have people we're working with that are living in Ross who have been concerned about the lack of contact from the county with regard to mitigation. Even though the county claims that they are contacting those residents. And the residents themselves, now I'm interested to know if you've actually begun to call on them seriously, because a number of them say that they haven't been called on at all, ever. So it looks to us that when you remove the bridge, it could cause flooding downstream. Yes, it may remove some of the parcels in town that flood, but then they're in a position to sue us if they flood, and it just is a huge mess. It looks to us.
Sure. So to answer the first question about contact with the residents downstream, we, as part of the field work that we need to do, there's some surveying elevations that we're looking at, like the not only the finished floor of the first finished floor of the structure, but we've had a couple of meetings with FEMA staff and the importance of looking at lowest adjacent grade, which is where the ground surface touches structure as well. So we're doing some surveying to fill any gaps that we have, and we've been coordinating with the property owners who are downstream to fill those gaps, as well as have really clear photographs of where that lowest adjacent grade is relative to the finished floor, and actually have our surveyor be able to measure and put a visual as to where the modeled base flood elevation is an existing condition and what it will be in the proposed condition, so that it's not only super clear to FEMA, but it's also clear to the property owners. And I think that visual has really helped with communication, so that people aren't just looking at numbers on a table, but it's actually numbers related to real, physical infrastructure. A picture can say 1,000 words. So we have had communication with the residents. Some have additional questions. As I mentioned, there's a large volume of questions and comments that have come in, and we want to address them all. Right now, we've started rolling out the first 20 or so answers based on the order that we've received questions, and we're trying to get through the queue. So as we're doing that, we've also been coordinating with those homeowners to obtain access to their properties, explain what we're doing, why we're collecting the data, showing some examples of other residences where we want to have a similar picture but for your property.
Where mitigation has already occurred, or
There is a modeled rise in that 100-year peak event.
yeah.
Keep in mind, it doesn't occur for the smaller 10-year event, which is really driving flood risk,
Right.
is those more frequent floods. But where there's a rise and where we need to gather data in order to assess the impact of that rise, because you can have rise in a creek, but it may not get to the structure, So we are still notifying those properties that have a rise on their property, even if it's not necessarily translating to impact and thus mitigation needed. So we're going through those 3 steps and filling in the gaps so that we can fill out our CLOMR application to FEMA and go through the correct process in order to assess the impact and the mitigation, and then eventually be able to, for those who do need some mitigation, which I can explain what that might look like, have an agreement with those property owners. Yeah. Yes.
Do you know the CFS difference between, 100-year flood now and with the the bridge removed? Do you have that difference to give us today?
Yeah, so
I was just curious.
In the one-dimensional model, the flow rate itself doesn't necessarily change. There may be a higher amount of it that will be conveyed through the creek instead of in our community and flooding homes on the floodplain.
So you
So
don't have a height
That's
difference?
impossible.
You don't have a height difference? Like they did that for the Corps of Engineer project, like the Lagunitas Bridge?
we have height. We have modeled height differences at different locations. So it's not as if, depending on where you are in the model downstream, you'll have a different result. So I can't give you one number, but
Not for at the bridge? You don't have that? I was just curious. And then what about, will the flow be obstructed by the Lagunitas Bridge downstream in Ross? That's a limiting thing.
Yeah.
Or is it all gonna just wash on here? Is that being looked at?
Yeah, so we have a consultant who is doing the hydraulic modeling and filling out the forms that are in the CLOMR application. And part of their job is to understand what is the reach that has actually hydraulic influence, that the removal of Building Bridge 2 affects the modeled base flood elevation. And so what it's looking like right now is that it diminishes basically at the downstream bridge of Sir Francis Drake near the confluence of Ross Creek. So that's really the extent between BB2 and the confluence of Ross Creek is kind of our domain of analysis.
Do you think you're saying that it would have an influence at that point, this removal of,
Yeah, so as modeled, it's on order, it's fractions of a foot. So, in orders of inch or two,
An inch or
depending on
two?
where you are.
an inch or two at the max?
Closer to, maybe slightly higher, further up.
Past, above the bridge, you say further up? or
No,
close to
no,
it?
just downstream of BV2. So, but that's where there's commercial buildings, right? That we have our businesses right here that straddle the creek. And we'll be looking at, if there's more water in the creek for the 100-year event, what is the increase in the pressure forces of that moving water? How does that translate to additional stress on those columns, those piers? So we're hiring a structural engineer in order to evaluate, is that de minimis? Do we need to provide any additional retrofit in order to, support those columns and whatnot?
But you are aware of the measures at the fire station, like 4 feet above the street, 200 feet before you even get to what you're going to remove. When flood strikes, it's waist high up at the fire station.
Right, right.
So it's going to be, I mean, I just don't see how anything removing below what you're talking about is so negligible in the total
So,
picture.
Yeah, that's a good question. If you think about it, when there's an obstruction, what the bridge building too is an obstruction to flow in the creek. So with that obstruction, the water actually backs up. So I'm not saying
Not, it's just, it flows.
hydraulically, technically, the water will rise, and then there will be a slope on that modeled water surface that translates upstream. So this project does not eliminate all flooding, but we're greatly reducing the flood risk upstream in those areas.
Can you define greatly, guys?
Yeah, yeah, good question. So we had as part of a FEMA grant application to help fund the project, we did what's known as a benefit cost analysis. And so in total, the component of the SAFER project, the SAFER project includes the flow diversion storage basin that was built above Fairfax, so that's built, so that half of the SAFER project is complete. And that, I can get to that later, but I want to hear everyone's questions too. Yeah, so the flood risk reduction, when we look at those more frequent floods, because San Anselmo Creek naturally will flood at a 5 to 6 year return period, which is fairly often. So that's in any given year,
Every
there's
5 or
maybe
6 years?
a 20% likelihood that it could overtop its banks, which is very high, so close to a dense community like this. So we had a consultant model the 10-year event, which is higher magnitude, the 25-year, and the 100-year event.
Okay.
And so the 10-year event is 10 times more likely to occur in a given year than the 100-year event. So we're looking at flood impact for each of those events, but we're also looking at the frequency that those events occur and integrating those two together. And that results in approximately a $23 million benefit over the lifetime of the project relative to the $11 million cost of the project.
Can you say something about the 10-year flood event? What is the 10-year flood event? I'm sorry, there's so many questions.
So does that answer your question?
We have a flood, we have the 10-year flood range, and we're gonna put in these two mitigating efforts, right, the basin and the removal of the bridge. How much is that gonna reduce the flooding? You converted from flooding to dollars, which I can't quite.
Yeah.
I live in the flood zone. And
There's
there's
a-
a probability that my house doesn't flood now. the flood.
Right.
I'm having a hard time equating.
It's, in terms of the reduction in flood risk, it's hundreds of homes that the flood risk will be reduced.
But we're talking about
I believe BB2, it's somewhere around 500 properties.
How much? 1 inch? 6 inches? What?
Well, on the fringes, it's actually, we're gonna look at the numbers, but it could be dozens of properties that are currently mapped in the 100-year floodplain that will not be after the map revision.
You said last time in the meeting that there was no survey, these were just equations, you took the squares on a piece of paper, so you haven't actually looked at this in terms of water on certain spectra. So this is pretty much like speculation and not, and I know all of this isn't speculation, but that's, given the amount of scrutiny you put on these houses downstream that require mitigation from FEMA before you go ahead, where you're crawling up every inch of them with, measuring tapes and you're trying to get out and mitigate them. The fact that there has been no actual survey or anything besides an equation determining what actually happens as far as flood reduced risk on the upstream properties, this is sort of a very unbalanced and non-concrete way to go forward. And also, we don't really have, on paper we have 10-year floods. Realistically, if you look over the last, 100 years or so, we don't flood every 10 years, we flood every 25 years, and it's always deemed a 100-year flood. So, it's a nice idea, but in reality, we're not getting the same impacts that you're claiming as far as risk reduction.
Yeah, there's no 10-year floods.
Yes.
Me?
Yes.
Hi, I was in the last flood, and it is every 20 years, and I'm expecting it to happen next year. I was expecting it this year too. I come to every meeting. I help put together a group called the Flood Mitigation League, and we work hand in hand with Hal Brown and then with Katie Rice to try to get some changes made. And every year I ask the same question. I bet money that it's not on your list. What are you going to, the money that we are paying on our taxes every year, what percentage of that is going to go to help the people once we do flood, because we will flood? And I know you're new at this, but there's no way we can correct any problem that happens until when the next flood happens. That's been said many times. And the difference that you're talking about, what I have heard, is about an inch. Well, my property an inch lower is still going to be flooded regardless. Sure. So I'm just concerned about, so many things that, my question was, how are you, I'd like that to be on your frequently asked questions, is what are you going to do to help the people once we do flood? Because FEMA gave me $35, or not, the cost of a trash bin to throw away my destroyed property. And my insurance only didn't pay for contents, and I had a lot of loss.